the one chosen by the organizers of this conference is about the most arid and pulverulent I could have ever conceived. I thought either the organizers truly have a predilection for catacomb-like academicism, and truly abide by my personal precept that every man over 40 ought to be serious and hopefully angry 90% of the time. Or else the organizers have provided us with an elegant and media-unfriendly way of having us talk about something else. Because to me, to talk about the nation state and whether it has a future here today is really to talk about destiny. About the ability to define that destiny and about the ability to remain masters of it. It is also to do so, not only as heirs to a particular legacy, not only as islanders or specific expressions of Europeanness, but also as Europeans in general, as well as individual families, and even as individuals. Because mastery of one's destiny begins with mastery over one's being and becoming. Mastery of what we are, and mastery over what we want to become. The aim of the nation-state was to serve as an iron shield for the sovereignty of a particular people living within a geographical area. And integral to the aims of the nation-state have been the promotion of a national identity as opposed to tribal and regional ones, the promotion of an official language as opposed to a babel of tongues and dialects. Did you know that at the time of the French Revolution, only 1 in 8 Frenchmen spoke fluent French? The promotion of mass instruction, teaching the national history, often with a semi-mythological tenor, and mass media, maintaining the national consciousness. All of which has tended to maximize homogeneity within and accentuate differentiation without, which is the essence of nationalism. The nation-state is closely associated with 19th century European nationalisms, even though the nation-state had precursors in early modernity, for example in Portugal and the Republic of the Seven United Netherlands. So it is a modern entity, and like much that is modern, possibly a transient one. The fact that it is considered to be in crisis by some, the fact that its future is now in doubt, and the fact that some consider it to be dead altogether, like as does the current President of the European Council, results from its defining characteristics. Because it is true, its use of the nation-state as an instrument of national unity, as an instrument of centralization and uniformity, from there as an instrument of integration and conformity, together with some of the developments that came along with the nation-state, such as the invention of the printing press, the emergence of free market capitalism, together with radical movements that arose in response to capitalism, have in modernity and in post-modernity since proven agents of national dissolution. National industry has become global enterprise. National banking has become global finance. National media has become global conglomerates. National airlines have become global businesses. ARPANET has become the internet. And in response to these processes of universalization, there have been converse processes of particularization, regionalisms, tribalisms, racialisms, identity politics. And in this rapidly destabilizing environment of porous borders, negotiated identities, fluidity, hybridity, deracination, racialization, diasporic liminalities, ambivalent loyalties, in such an environment, conservatism, which for some is a conservation of nativisms and nationalisms, perceives itself as having a vital role, more vital now than ever before, which is to serve as a bulwark, as a wall of containment against undesirable forms of change, disintegrative forms of change that threaten the national identity and thereby the national sovereignty. But the truth is, conservatism has failed. Politics across the West have drifted further and further to the left. For decades, maybe centuries, conservatism has only known one gear, reverse gear. Mainstream conservatism has compromised, accommodated, and sold out. Even worse, it has cut itself off from its intellectual vanguard, thereby justifying the perception that many have that conservatism is bereft of ideas, that conservatism is simply the politics of fear. And mainstream conservatives are afraid. They are motivated by fear, which is why they're always on the defensive, never acting but always reacting. Reacting against the aggression of the left, allowing themselves to be shaped by it, rather than defining themselves on their own terms. The left is also a negation, but it is active. It has the initiative, which is partly why, despite having been proven wrong again and again and again, the left has been largely successful. Now, there are reasons why conservatism has failed. In this country, as we know, one of them has been reliance on the Conservative Party. And not because it has ceased to be conservative, but because it has remained conservative all along. Because it has, the Labour Party under Tony Blair has no problem adopting Conservative Party policies for this reason. The mistake is in confusing conservation with keeping traditions. Because it is possible to be conservative by conserving something that is anti-traditional. And this is something that few realize even today, which explains why many of those who are concerned with tradition continue to support the conservatives. Because on the surface, the conservatives have retained vestigial trappings of tradition. Of course, they get smaller and smaller, and they get shallower and shallower. But they're still closer to a tradition than the Labour or the Liberal Democrats. But any tendency towards tradition the conservatives may have, it is purely sentimental and has no theoretical grounding whatsoever. Ideologically, the Conservative Party has in fact always been anti-traditional. You may ask yourselves, how is it that the Conservatives can govern in coalition with the Liberal Democrats? Well, the answer is simple. They both started out as factions of the same political party, which was the Whig Party, which was the party that came to be identified with liberal ideas, which is the reason why by the mid-1800s it became the Liberal Party, which in 1989 would merge with the Social Democrats, which originated as an offshoot of the Labour Party, at a time when it had been so thoroughly infiltrated by Trotskyists that old-fashioned socialism had come to be regarded as conservative and reactionary and right-wing within the party. The result of that merger was the Liberal Democrats, whereas the Conservative Party has its origins in the faction of the Whig Party that supported William Pitt the Younger, who since his death has been described as a Tory, but who in fact, and like every politician of his era, utterly rejected the label, describing himself instead as an independent Whig. And when later on Sir Robert Peel laid down the foundations for the modern Conservative Party with the Tamworth Manifesto in 1834, for the most part, it was a commitment to reform. The default position was change, and the non-default position was to reject change only when deemed unnecessary. Robert Peel's supporters would later join up with the Whigs and the Radicals, who were the left of the left at the time, to form the Liberal Party. The colloquial use of the label Tory has added to the confusion, because the original Tory party was effectively defunct already in 1714, well before the Pittites came along. And therefore, however ridiculous it was for him to say that the solution to a problem is more of what caused the problem in the first place. David Cameron was not an historical anomaly when he said that the solution to the failure of multiculturalism was muscular liberalism. By saying that, he was perfectly consistent with the conservative legacy. They are quite happy with the way things have been going. And they just want to slow down things a little and attenuate some of the most obnoxious leftist undertones that have crept up under Labour governments. Although they are, by now, quite happy to accept some of those too. David Cameron is a signatory of the UAF, which descends from Trotskyist and anarchist groups. And this goes to the root of why conservatism has failed, because commitment to liberal ideas has meant that the only tradition being conserved in the long run is the liberal tradition of political philosophy. Now, liberalism, particularly in its classical form, is not all bad. It stands for individual liberty, individual rights, private property, autonomy, bodily integrity, and consent. But unfortunately, it also contains two very negative features. One is that it stands against tradition, and the other is that it stands for equality. And this is what I'd like to focus on today, because equality is radically opposed to tradition. Tradition is about meaning, and meaning relies on making distinctions, which means tradition, and on the application of value to those distinctions, which means that tradition is also about hierarchy, not in an oppressive material sense, but in a spiritual sense. In a sense that there are things that make us great and things that make us small. And in the sense that we use these to orientate ourselves, to invest our lives with direction and purpose, all of which is fundamental to being human. And we consider egalitarianism immoral for this reason. In classical liberalism, equality did not have the preeminence it came to possess under modern liberalism. Initially, the highest value was individual liberty. The liberal project was about the liberation of the individual from tradition, from religion, from the supernatural, from the hierarchical society in which individuals enjoyed semi-divine status, and in some, from any transcendent or supra-individual agency. Equality did not have initially the strong moral dimension that it later acquired. When Thomas Hobbes talked about equality, he saw it as a necessary condition for entering into the social contract, because he thought that no one would be willing to enter into such a contract unless it applied to everybody equally. Therefore, for him, equality before the law was a practical matter. But by the time of the American Revolution, and especially the French Revolution, egalitarianism had become a moral philosophy. It was a secularization of a principle that already existed in Christianity, which was present in Stoic philosophy, which Christianity had absorbed, and in Cynic philosophy before that. After the liberals attained political power in the 18th century, they were challenged by Marxism in the 19th century. Now the right applies the terms liberal and left almost interchangeably. And this may have been correct once upon a time. But today, this is inaccurate. Firstly, because conservatives today are liberals. And secondly, because Marxism is anti-liberal. Marxism originated as a critique of liberalism. And the fundamental Marxian criticism, although they expressed it differently at the time, was that the liberals had failed to deliver on the promise of equality, because through private property and free market capitalism, the liberals encouraged the development of hierarchies, which perpetuated the subjection of one class of individuals by another. Later on, fascism came to challenge both liberalism and Marxism, being an anti-egalitarian critique of both ideologies. But fascism was defeated in 1945, and Marxism would later collapse in 1989. But as others have pointed out, it didn't matter that communism collapsed in the East, because by then Marxism had been successful in the West. Not by making the West communist, of course, but by influencing Western liberalism in a Marxian direction. You see, the liberals and the Marxists share a belief in the goodness of equality. So the liberals had to respond to the Marxian challenge on this issue. And although there was opposition to curtailing individual liberty in favor of greater equality, and we can see this in Ayn Rand's movement and in the libertarian movement, in the end, the liberals, because they believed in equality, succumbed to the logic of egalitarianism, resulting in a long period of compromises, defeats, and realignments. And the result of which was a brand of egalitarianism in which equality is the highest moral good. We can speak of a Hegelian synthesis. Thus classical liberalism gave way to modern liberalism. The Frankfurt School of Social Research played a key role in mediating this process after the war. And more broadly, so was the New Left in the 1960s and 1970s. But the battle is still raging, driven by the academic establishment, which is committed to a Freudian-Marxist scholastic tradition, which continues to shape the worldview of future establishment leaders. For many, the only morally viable alternative today, and only just, is libertarianism. But libertarians are politically a minority. For all intents and purposes, modern liberalism is the only game in town in the West. And this means that egalitarianism is the single most powerful idea defining the direction of thought, the direction of policy in all areas. In politics, which is dominated by the liberals, in academia, which is dominated by the left, in the public discourse, which is dominated by the liberal left media, and by the desire of ordinary people to be liked and accepted by their friends, by their families, by their employers, by their future employers, and by their fellow citizens. I've said this before, but it bears restating. We perceive the establishment as corrupt, and we think of our age as the winter of civilization, the Kali Yuga, as twilight age of apathy, selfishness, materialism, chaos, and moral dissolution. But we are in fact living in a puritanical age. Because when it comes to the belief in the moral goodness of equality, the system demands from us absolute purity of thought. And those who deviate, the skeptics, the unbelievers, the proud heretics, who are vocal in their unbelief, are savagely punished. They are mercilessly flagellated with professional and fiscal sanctions. They are ostracized and in some cases prosecuted. And most importantly, their humanity is brought into question. So from the point of view of current moral philosophy, here in the West, we are living or approaching a golden age of puritanical egalitarianism. And the search for moral purity bears obvious signs of religiosity. We encounter endless soul searching, endless witch hunts, endless acts of confession and atonement. And even the policing of offenders and of the criminal justice system is not immune from the demand of moral purity. After the execution of Bridget Bishop during the Salem witch trials in colonial Massachusetts, the court of Oyer and Terminer adjourned for 20 days in order to seek advice from the most influential ministers of New England. When the reply came, item number 3 read, quote, "We judge that in the prosecution of these and all such witchcrafts, there is need for a very critical and exquisite caution, lest by too much credulity for things received only upon the devil's authority, there be a door open for a long train of miserable consequences, and Satan get an advantage over us. For we should not be ignorant of his devices. End quote. This was written in 1692, and yet it sounds so uncannily contemporary, does it not? It reads like the Macpherson Report. And the reign of fear extends beyond the public figures and institutions. Because even private individuals who hold deviant opinions live in terror at the prospect of discovery. And it's not necessarily that they express politically incorrect opinion X, and the next thing they hear is a knock on their doors in the depth of the night, before they are dragged away by the commissars of equality and made to disappear in the gulags of liberal democracy. Because even nonconformists are careful about what they say, and even where and among whom consequences are unlikely. They couch their speech in euphemisms. They talk around the issue. They choke their statements with paranoid prolepses and qualifications. Even then, when they're alone, the only space they feel safe is the space inside their skulls. And even then, they live in fear of their own thoughts. It's easy to laugh at political correctness, and yet we cannot just roll our eyes and ask people to toss it away like a banana peel. Because it is not just propaganda, although propaganda is a factor. It's much more powerful than that. And it's not that there is a lack of information. In fact, one could say that there's too much information. People cannot make sense of it. They have neither the time, nor the expertise, nor the energy even to try and get to the bottom of things. And neither is it that people cannot educate themselves. It is now possible for people to research everything imaginable on their own. And given how many conspiracy theories there are, people are quite willing to entertain dissident perspectives and to question the official histories and the official versions of events. In fact, it makes them feel powerful and in the know in a so-called democracy where politicians do more or less what they like. And neither is it that politicians are so fiendishly clever that they manage to deceive the voters in every single election. Most people are skeptical of politicians. Many people vote for the least bad option. Most people don't even bother to vote at all. The reason certain opinions are marginalized is that they are considered to be immoral. Political correctness may have become risible, but its power does not lie in money. Its power derives from its perceived legitimacy. Egalitarianism as an ethics endures because there is a generalized consensus, which includes conservatism, in which equality is seen as something we have an absolute moral obligation to pursue. Even if it is inconvenient, even if it is costly, even if it is inefficient, even if it has no basis in the real world, the morality of an ideal trumps empirical reality. So we absolutely must look at this issue from an ethical, from a moral philosophical point of view. Not from a logical point of view, not from a logistical point of view, not from an economic point of view. Egalitarianism is an ethical problem. Before we can hope to make headway with a traditionalist alternative, which necessarily implies hierarchy and differentiation, egalitarianism must be attacked at the level of theory, at the level of first principles, because that is the foundation of their power. Demolish the foundation, you can build something new. And this should have been clear for decades, if not centuries ago. Because in any debate about sovereignty, in a modern nation state like Britain, or France, or Germany, or the United States, whether it concerns immigration, whether it concerns globalization, whether it concerns citizenship, or taxation, or terrorism, or the welfare state, every single issue is filtered through the moral prism of whether or not it affronts the ideal of equality. Let's begin with immigration. When conservatives pronounce themselves against it, their arguments are always practical arguments. Immigrants cost more than they produce. They put pressure on the benefits system. They put pressure on public services. They drive down property prices. Sometimes they invoke legality. They are breaking the law. They are engaging in criminal activity. And in the rare occasions where the arguments are about identity, they are purely sociological. Some types of immigrants don't assimilate. Lack of assimilation may lead to radicalization and social tension. All of these arguments are easily defeated by promoters of immigration, particularly when they're ideological, because they can, and they do, always present their arguments in moral terms. They come here to work and pay taxes. They come here looking for a better life. They come here escaping poverty and torture. There's no place for bigotry in the 21st century. No human is illegal. And in all these high-flown statements, there is an underlying accusation of moral turpitude. Because everybody knows that the word immigration is a euphemism. Because everybody knows that the problem is not so much immigration per se, but the types of immigration. Because deep down, and despite any protestations to the contrary, and this includes the immigrants themselves, many regard them as neither equivalent nor interchangeable with the natives, which implies that that the natives and that family, the broader European family, possess an essential quality that makes them not the same, unequal, which is a violation of the ethical code, and therefore cannot be allowed under any circumstances. And the result is a loss of sovereignty. And because it is rooted in moral philosophy rather than on practical considerations, conservatives who are allergic to abstract thought do not have an effective answer. They don't have intellectual weapons, which is why they end up compromising and backtracking and capitulating over and over again on this and related issues. Now this makes conservatives look like hypocrites, because on the one hand, they present themselves as defenders of the traditional nation, but on the other, they consistently betray it. And they are made to look like hypocrites in another way, because as soon as they begin to do what they were elected to do, they are reminded that there is a precept that they must never contravene, and that those measures that they promised, that they began to implement in the interest of tradition and sovereignty, are unethical. And they are reminded, in other words, that their purpose is indefensible. And the other side knows it. The other side knows that as soon as conservatives go over the line, it's just a question of applying enough pressure and deploying the usual arsenal of unfalsifiable arguments and slogans because should conservatives attempt to defend themselves, they can easily be made to look selfish and small-minded and can be broken every single time. And who can respect people like that? When there is resistance, it comes from traditionalists, who are invariably met with perplexity. The vice president of this group was attacked in the media this last summer for stating that Doreen Lawrence lacked merit to be a peer of the realm, for suggesting that she was not an example of the best that Britain can offer. Because that was the original idea. In the days of yore, one was ennobled, one was allowed to become a member of the nobility if one was deemed to be of the highest character, to have rendered singular service to the country, to represent the best. The vice president of this group was also attacked for suggesting that people have natural homelands, a suggestion that implies that a person's homeland is not determined by civil servants using bureaucratic procedures. Vanessa Feltz said in her radio program that Gregory's views were impossible to understand. Impossible to understand. She suggested that her colleagues were all nervous in the studio, biting their nails, clinging on to their control, unable to compute. Let's talk about citizenship. When Lee Rigby was decapitated in South London earlier this year, one of his assailants delivered a few remarks to a bystander who recorded them. And among other things, he said, "By Allah, we swear by the Almighty Allah, we shall never stop fighting you until you leave us alone. I apologize that women had to witness this today, but in our land, our women have to see the same. You people will never be safe. Remove your governments. Tell them to bring our troops back so we can," and then he corrects himself, "so that you can live in peace. Leave our lands and you will live in peace." Now, Michael Adebolajo repeatedly used "you" to refer to British people and "our" to refer to foreign countries living under Islam. And the interesting part of this is that Mr. Adebolajo is not a Nigerian immigrant. He, like his accomplice, is a full British citizen. Born in Lambeth, central London. His statements suggest clearly that neither he nor his accomplice identify with Britain or British people. Even though the label British has become highly elasticated. These are individuals who were born in the mid-80s and early 1990s respectively, who have lived in the United Kingdom all their lives and were educated in a British university in politically correct anti-racist Britain. Indeed, the younger assailant lived most of his life under the Labour government dominated by Tony Blair. The diverse immigrant's best friend. Clearly, their loyalties are commanded by something more powerful, more essential than their civic status. Even though their parents live here, the real family, literally and metaphorically, is elsewhere. Their essential identity is something that they carry with them, that is inside, that goes where they go. And it's not something to be acquired by legal means, or by education, or by length of residence. It says something that Blair saw it necessary to require a pledge of loyalty from anyone wishing to hold British citizenship. Under ordinary circumstances, this would have been deemed completely superfluous. And this is clearly not limited to a few extremists, because it was also deemed necessary to have an American-style ceremony on the basis that those being welcomed into the fold were not taking their citizenship seriously. On the basis that they were seen to have a purely instrumental relationship to it. And yet, anyone daring to guess that peoples from very different cultures and very distant origins have natural homelands elsewhere will be regarded not as mistaken or misinformed, but as moral. We could also talk about international development. Mainstream conservatives feel that they must absolutely commit thousands of millions of pounds in international development, and to increase their commitment every year. This despite record levels of deficits and debt and cuts everywhere, while pensioners and war veterans in this country live in poverty.
Yeah.
It's obvious that this is unfair. But in this rich country, that charge is easily countered with the notion that those who have too little have a moral claim on those who have too much. It's a Marxian notion,
Yeah.
founded once again on egalitarian principles. So we see that Cameron, as an egalitarian liberal, cannot possibly cut funding for international development. He will be branded as heartless and immoral. it's difficult to imagine that the nation-state will survive in this climate, particularly because the nation-state already provides a template for the creation of super-states, and because, as per the ideology of progress, which is shared by the liberals and the left, there is a perception that we must go from less to more. Therefore, the decline of the nation-state and the birth of the multinational super-state, defined, of course, not by anything traditional, but by universalist egalitarian principles, seems like a logical and inevitable development. A development that would be indicative of human progress. But it's not progress. It's just one model out of a possible many, some of which have yet to be imagined. And I'm not sure that the nation-state is necessarily worth saving, because it is a product of its time. It may have been adequate for the needs of a previous era, but there is a large question mark of whether it meets our needs today. So I wouldn't focus on preserving the nation-state, simply because we're used to it or because it's worked for a long time. Nothing is eternal. Our countries will eventually disappear. And the question is whether we define that process or whether the process comes to define us. The issue then is not how we remain masters of ourselves in a world where old boundaries are being redefined or reimagined or erased altogether, and in which conservatism is not about conserving traditions, but about conserving what led us here. I think that the biggest obstacle to the continuity of our being and our destiny is this immoral belief in equality as the highest good. That is what prevents discussion. That is what prevents what must be thought from being thinkable. That is what prevents the computation of a much-needed traditionalist perspective during the most important crisis facing the West today. And this is why I don't think that we need yet more facts, or more statistics, or more apocalyptic pronunciations. The information is out there, and has been out there for at least 100 years. And a lot of people know it, or know about it. What they need is a reason to feel righteous about possessing that information. A reason to feel that they are good, moral people while putting forth a radical and futuristic argument for tradition. Only then will they be able to do so openly, with real conviction, and without fear. And for that, we need a moral critique of egalitarianism. Not a demonstration of its lack of correspondence with empirical reality, but a moral critique, not an effort to disprove equality, but an effort to discredit the pursuit of equality. To do otherwise is to deal with symptoms. It is to get lost in the nettles and the weeds, when the problem demands a solution that goes right down to the root, the application of a good dose of Roundup, in order so that we may plant something new, which provides a moral justification not for equality, and certainly not for degrading anyone, but for difference, for excellence, for uniqueness, for tradition, and for mutual respect. This is what it means to be radical and traditional. I have written about egalitarianism before, and in another speech I will provide a roadmap as to how egalitarianism can be taken apart as an ethical system. But meanwhile, I invite you also to explore this issue and redefine the rules and turn the tables and be radical and traditional and feel that you have something good, something righteous, and something that is worth fighting for, today, tomorrow, and always. Thank you very much.